Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Royal Photographic Society. And it's a real pleasure this evening to introduce Tim Smith to you. Tim's a photojournalist, and obviously I think all of us are aware what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. Tim visited Ukraine back in 1991, and he's going to talk us through a little bit about his experiences then and bring us up to date with Ukraine and the situation. Tim's very happy to take questions through the presentation, so do feel free to drop them into chat and I shall relay them back to Tim. The programme for this evening is that Tim will talk for about 40-45 minutes, pick up with any questions during the presentation, but we're also happy to take questions at the end of the formal presentation, and we're aiming to finish around about 7 o'clock British time. So Tim, over to you. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. And as Michael said, I'm going to be showing you a lot of photographs from that kind of black and white analog era that some of you may remember, others not. And although Michael said that I'm going to bring you up to date with what's happening in Ukraine now, I'll just explain that a little bit in that I'm not going to show you any photographs taken in Ukraine since the crisis unfolded over the last couple of months. I mean, I'm sure you've seen plenty of those still photographs and video and what have you. I haven't visited Ukraine for a number of years, but hopefully what I do aim to do is to just kind of try and explain how what's happening there now is very much shaped by what's happened in Ukraine and that wider region over the past, well, since the 1930s, really, getting on for a century. And in many ways, I think that history of Ukraine is kind of encapsulated in a lot of the things that myself and colleagues who I'll tell you about in a minute, a lot of that history is encapsulated in what was happening in Ukraine in 1991. And we went in between the period when Ukraine declared independence in August 1991, and they decided to hold a referendum to find out what Ukrainians wanted to do, whether or not they wanted to become independent of the Soviet Union. And obviously the answer was a resounding yes, with I think it was 92% of those that voted saying that they wanted to become independent of the Soviet Union, which was effectively a Russian-led empire run from Moscow. And I'd also just like to kind of issue one caveat that apologies to those of you who know your Soviet history, your Ukrainian history, and so on, that I'm not a historian. I know a little bit about the history of Ukraine, but for reasons of brevity, I will be making some generalizations because it is a long and very complex history, and to even kind of skim across the surface of that would take a lot longer than the 45 minutes allocated here. So really it is a kind of a reflection on that history, but done through my own kind of personal experience of it, and illustrated by the pictures that I took that I have taken over the past 35 years or so. So here we go. And in many ways, I suppose I've put these two photographs in at the beginning. This first one is a picture of a vigil outside the Bradford Law Courts in the city square, taken in 1986. And it's a Christmas vigil, and it's members of Bradford's Ukrainian community protesting about Soviet treatment of people practicing their religion in Ukraine. And the two women in the centre there are dressed as prisoners in the Gulag, and on the right there is their Soviet guard. And then there's this picture, which I took just a couple of weeks ago, at, again, Bradford Ukrainians, or British-born Ukrainians from Bradford, at a rally in Manchester. I think it was 10 days, 2 weeks after the current Russian invasion. And it seems awful to say it, but, you know, these two pictures, one's almost a repeat of the other, and hopefully you'll get a kind of better understanding of that over the next half an hour or so. So the story really started for me when I arrived in Bradford in 1985. I studied photography at Newport College of Art, which was a well-known kind of documentary photography stroke photojournalism college. And a couple of years after graduating from there, I came to live and work in Bradford, working for something called the Bradford Heritage Recording Unit, which at the time was largely an oral history unit which collected photographs from somebody, and then they took on me and other photographers to take photographs of the communities in Bradford, which could complement the oral history interviews that they were doing. And one of the big, or two big projects that they were doing when I arrived, one was on the textile industry, and as many of you know, Bradford was the global centre of the wool and textiles trade. And the other was on the Eastern European communities that lived in the city. So little was known about them. I think the kind of statistic I usually kind of quote at people is that if you went to the local studies library, which had loads of material on this, that and the other in Bradford, there were 2 press clippings about the Eastern European communities in Bradford, and that was it. And those communities were largely Poles and Ukrainians, and also Latvians, Lithuanians, other Baltic people, there was a Romanian club, Belarusian club, and so on and so forth. But Bradford was home to the largest community of Ukrainians in Western Europe. And I, for example, went up to the Association of Ukrainians club. This is their Christmas dinner for 1986, which in the 80s was an incredibly busy place. And I just kind of, you know, documented what went on there really in that kind of photojournalistic style that I'd become versed in at studying photography in Newport. And as I say, it was an incredible kind of vibrant place. And it was a fantastic place to take pictures, whether it be of the celebrations that went on there. This is again, I think, taken at the Christmas 1986 at the dance after the dinner you saw earlier. And on the left there, we can see a couple in their kind of typically 1980s shiny attire. And then on the right-hand side, you've got members of that original first-generation refugee community that came over in the wake of the Second World War. And there's a couple doing the last dance. And then from the club, I started visiting the churches. There's 2 Ukrainian churches in Bradford. This is the Catholic, Ukrainian Catholic Church in the Manningham area of the city. And the fantastic thing about kind of going into these places, and the churches in particular, was that you kind of stood outside the church, and you were quite obviously in Bradford, in a industrial Yorkshire town or city, but you stepped inside the doorway, and it wasn't that you were actually in Ukraine. You hadn't gone to Ukraine, but you were almost halfway there, because everyone was speaking Ukrainian. It sounded Ukrainian. It looked Ukrainian. It smelt Ukrainian. And I found Bradford was an amazing city where you could kind of travel the world, if you like, just through stepping through different doorways. And this is an old traditional, I think it was Anglican church originally, which has now been, converted into a Ukrainian Catholic church. And there's one of a Ukrainian Catholic nun with the collection basket there. And this is a tea in the church hall afterwards. And one thing I learned was that the Ukrainians community it was extremely well organized. It was very well networked. There were communities in lots of industrial towns, Bradford, Halifax, Leeds, Manchester, Huddersfield, in the Midlands, in places like Nottingham, mainly the industrial towns, and also down in London, where, for example, copies of that newspaper that you can see in the foreground of the picture that were produced. Well, I'll just go back to this picture, because one thing I think that I learned as I kind of immersed myself more and more in the stories of the Ukrainian community was that I used to hear these stories of Ukrainian history and so on, and a lot of it did seem very kind of, well, I found it hard to believe to start with. It seemed rather melodramatic, some of the stories that people told me, and that Ukrainians would tell the interviewers. And I'm not kind of doubting their word, but I think as, a 20-something photographer who had travelled a bit, I'd lived in lots of different places when I was growing up, but I'd never lived anywhere like the Soviet Union. And just hearing the stories that people that I met taking these pictures just seemed very hard to believe. This is the Ukrainian Orthodox church on the other side of Bradford, in a place called Fagley. And again, it was stepping inside there was like almost stepping into a little kind of mini Ukraine, a Ukraine in exile that these refugee communities had created. And this church was kind of run by the Reverend Mikhailo Hatuni, who you can see in the picture here. And he had an absolutely extraordinary life story to tell. Here's a portrait of him that I took for the Observer newspaper, I think it was. And one thing that he spoke of in his interview to the Heritage Unit, the oral history people, was how, as a child growing up in central Ukraine, he lived in a town not far north of Mariupol, which I'm sure many of you will have heard. Well, it's often discussed on the news for the awful things that are going on there at the moment. But he, as a child, was one of millions of people that suffered as part of what's known by the Ukrainians as the Holodomor, which means death by hunger. It was a famine that was kind of created by the Soviet authorities, really, as a result of the forced collectivization of agriculture that was happening in Ukraine, where the Soviets were taking land off landowners, the kulaks, and forcing people to work in collective farms. And they were shipping a lot of the grain from Ukraine, which was the kind of breadbasket of the Soviet Union, shipping it to the cities in other parts of the Soviet Empire. And as a result, it's estimated that between 3 million and 7 million Ukrainians died of famine. And one of those who died was Reverend Hutuna's father. And he talked very movingly in his interview of how, as children, they survived that famine. And the woman, this is just outside the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, as people were leaving a service, which the church is behind me as I took this picture, and then the church hall is on the right-hand side there. And that woman in the centre there, Mrs. Vera Smereka, was another woman that the Heritage Unit interviewed. And again, she was a childhood survivor of the Holodomor. And she had another extraordinary life story where, when the Nazis invaded Ukraine in their campaign, when they I'll take a step back and just let people know that when the Second World War started, we in the UK, everybody knows that Hitler invaded Poland, but perhaps what's lesser known is that Hitler and Stalin had signed a pact where Russia or the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, and that they'd kind of arranged for Poland to be carved up, so Eastern Poland became part effectively part of the Soviet Union, and Western Poland was part of was occupied by Hitler's Nazi forces. And then in 1941, the Nazis then invaded Russia and the other territories occupied by the Soviets, which included Ukraine, of course. And at that point, Mrs. Smereka, who you can see in the centre there, was deported as a forced labourer to Germany, like millions of, or certainly hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and other Eastern Europeans was taken to Nazi Germany to work in munitions factories, or others worked on farms and so on. And Mrs. Smereka talks of how she then had to work in these munitions factories during the day, and at night she had to survive or shelter from Allied air raids. And this is in the Orthodox Church Hall with a portrait of somebody whose face I've become very familiar with, the kind of father of Ukrainian literature, if you like, a poet called Taras Shevchenko. And this community at the end of the war, because of what had gone on in Ukraine with the forced famine and other kind of Stalinist, well, it was a totalitarian regime. The people that had been displaced by the war, either those who had fought for the Red Army, some of them had fought for the Germans, others like Mrs. Smereka had been taken to Germany as forced labourers. They didn't want to return to a life under Stalin, having experienced it for themselves in the 1930s or heard about it through other Ukrainians. They felt, quite rightly, historians think, that if they did go back to life in the Soviet Union, they would simply be shot or imprisoned. So many of them came to Britain as what were known as European volunteer workers or displaced persons, and they ended up in places like Bradford, because Bradford needed workers to work in the textile industry. And this kind of history of Ukraine was also taught in Ukrainian Saturday schools, where second and third generation Ukrainians, British Ukrainians, would go to learn the language, as this young girl's doing here. Many of them spoke Ukrainian because it was the lingua franca in their households, but they were taught how to write Ukrainian, and they were also taught Ukrainian history. And as well as working with the community in Bradford, I also kind of went further afield. This is the Ukrainian school in Manchester, again, where they're learning how to write the Ukrainian language. And I think it's fair to say that much of this kind of idea of Ukraine that was kind of talked about and transmitted to the children, on the one hand, it had this very kind of brutal and pretty grim history, but on the other hand, it was also this kind of romantic land of well, as shown in that picture there, that the children are creating, of, you know, land of folk dancing and rural idyll and so on and so forth. And I think that kind of sense of Ukrainian community, this kind of mix of this quite terrible history, but this beautiful rural idyll was part of this kind of Ukrainian exile that was created by the communities that lived in towns like Bradford, Manchester, Nottingham, and those that I've listed before. This is the Ukrainian church in Cheetham Hill. And what you'd find is that the Ukrainians would often live in those areas that are often traditional centres of migration, like in Bradford, there's areas like Manningham and Little Horton. In Manchester, Cheetham Hill was a big centre for the Ukrainian community, not just the Ukrainians, but the Poles and other post-war refugees. And then, for example, when, say, the Asian community started turning up later on in the late 50s and early 60s, those were areas where they went to live because of cheap housing and access to industrial work and so on and so forth. So most of these pictures were taken in the late 1980s. This is another picture taken in Manchester at a march to mark, I think, what was the first anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster. And again, I think Chernobyl in northern Ukraine, as I'm sure most, if not all of you will know, it was another indication of the kind of moral bankruptcy of the Soviet system, really, where the Soviets initially denied that there were any problems, and it was only through radiation levels rising in places like Sweden and Norway and other Scandinavian countries that there was this kind of realization that there'd been this terrible accident. And to start with, the Soviets, you know, denied it flatly. And it was only as kind of news leaked out and they finally had to admit that there had been these problems with the reactors at Chernobyl. Again, it was something that really kind of fueled Ukrainian anger, if you like, at what the Soviet Union was doing in Ukraine. And this is a picture taken in Halifax of a Ukrainian couple getting married at the Ukrainian Catholic Church there, I think it is. And this is their wedding reception, dancing to a kind of Ukrainian folk rock band. There's another one of those typical 1980s shiny suits on view, with, of course, all the Ukrainian embroidery and so on in the background. And a couple of times I also went to, there's a big national gathering at a Ukrainian summer camp in Weston-on-Trent, which is near Derby. Now, when the Ukrainians first came over as refugees, many of them were housed in these old, well, these former army and RAF camps, which had obviously been vacated at the end of the war. And the Ukrainian community got together and bought one of these camps, and they then used it for this summer camp where they used to have these national gatherings each year. And again, it was a little bit like kind of stepping into a mini Ukraine in exile. You know, this picture was actually taken, I think, in 1994 when I went there. And it did very much remind me of Ukraine, not just the architecture and the language and the food and everything else, but also those silver birch trees, which you'll see wherever you go in Ukraine. And there's the Hospoda Ukrainian Country Club. And what happened towards the end of the 1980s was that people started visiting from Ukraine. In previous decades, and certainly in the mid-1980s, it was very difficult for people to travel. But in the late 1980s, in the Gorbachev era, people were coming over from Ukraine. And this is a man called Vasyl Romaniuk, who actually went on to become Patriarch of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And he's a man that, well, he led a service, as you see here, at the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Bradford, and he went around visiting lots of other Ukrainian communities around the country. And then he moved from the church here and gave a speech at the Ukrainian Club, where he talked about his 20 years spent in a Siberian labor camp, where he was sent as a political prisoner for, well, basically for practicing his faith in Soviet Ukraine. And then, of course, towards the end, or right at the end of the Gorbachev era, we had perestroika and glasnost. The Eastern European countries, like, well, all the Eastern European countries, Poland, East Germany, Romania, and so on, were asserting their independence. And then in August 1991, the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine announced its intention to become independent. And this is the caretaker up at the Ukrainian Club in Bradford, launching the Ukrainian flag to kind of celebrate that moment. And for many Ukrainians, I think it was almost like a kind of unattainable dream come true, because for the best part of 40 years or so, they'd always dreamed of Ukraine becoming an independent nation to which they could return, and so on and so forth. And I think it was something that they kind of hoped for, but didn't ever perhaps really expect to witness. But here in 1991, was it happening? And I'll just mention a little bit about the kind of history of Ukraine, because it is a very kind of fluid place, if you like. There's Eastern Ukraine in pink. There's kind of central Ukraine, which is in pink, yellow, and green. There's Crimea down the bottom, which was actually added to Ukraine by Khrushchev in 1954. And then in the far west, you've got that bit that was added to Ukraine in during the Second World War, which used to be part of Eastern Poland. Before that, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but it was kind of officially handed to Ukraine as a Soviet Socialist Republic in 1945 as part of the negotiations and the kind of carve-up of Europe that went on at Yalta between Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill. And with news of Ukraine becoming independent, it was something that I really felt I wanted to witness. And a former colleague of mine, Rob Perks, who you can see on the right here, who'd moved on to become curator of oral history at the National Sound Archive based at the British Library in London. He had met an oral historian from Moscow, who is Andrei, you can see on the left-hand side. And through Andrei, who identifies himself as Russian, but has a lot of friends and family in Ukraine, Rob arranged to visit Ukraine at this kind of pivotal moment in its history. So we all went between the Declaration of Independence in August of '91 and this big referendum they were having in December of that year. And Sergei is a friend of Andrei's who kind of acted as my interpreter fixer, and Andrei acted the same for Rob, and this is Rob interviewing a nun in Kiev, I think it was. Now at that time you couldn't fly directly to Ukraine from the west, you had to go via Moscow. So Rob went first and he travelled quite extensively in eastern Ukraine with Andrei, and then I couldn't go for the early part of the trip, but I flew to Moscow, met Sergei, we got on a train which travelled, I don't know, 20, 24 hours overnight into Ukraine. The Soviet Union was in chaos at that time, so I don't think anybody ever kind of asked us for permission to enter, and we agreed that I would just go to sleep if anybody, or pretend to be asleep if anyone came round and asked who we were and what we were doing, travelling from Russia into Ukraine. And then when we got to Kiev, or Kiev as I should say it now, it was an extraordinary time to be there. This was the main statue of Lenin that overlooked the main square in Kiev. The main square, a lot of people now know as the Maidan, where the protest took place in 2014. So they were taking down this big statue of Lenin. This is some graffiti scrawled at the bottom of it, equating the kind of red star of socialism, which you can see on the left, with Nazism, as represented by the swastika there. And then I also went back some 5 years later just to see if this dream of an independent Ukraine had come true. And I'll move on to that at the latter end of the talk. And that's the statue of Lenin that you saw here, lying in the garden of the Kiev History Museum some 5 years later. But when we got there in '91, as I say, it was a time of chaos. The agricultural system had collapsed. This is people queuing for food at one of the state-run shops in the city. So it was very difficult for people to get hold of food. We generally stayed with families that Andrei knew. This is the family that we stayed with in Kiev. And I think it took us a while to realize that the incredible level of hospitality that we were being offered, because, you know, people had to queue all day to put, you know, dinner on the table for us. And on the streets, there were just these big street exhibitions about this kind of history of Ukraine that was coming to light. This particular exhibition was about the Babi Yar tragedy, which was where 33,000 members of the Kiev's Jewish community were murdered by the Nazis over a period of just 3 days at the Babi Yar ravine. There was political debate everywhere. Everywhere you went, people were talking about the pros and cons of independence. This is a man who's very much supporting independence and arguing with people who were saying, well, you know, maybe we should stick with the communist order. It's what we know. Look at what's happening. We can't get any food. There's hyperinflation. Everything's falling apart. And he got this photograph of himself out of his wallet and was brandishing at people saying, this is me. Just a year or so before I was sent to the Soviet labor camps in Siberia for I can't remember what it was he was sent there, but people were sent there for something and nothing. You know, people were sent there for practicing their religion. They were sent to the Gulag for speaking the Ukrainian language, for writing poetry, for writing books, or they were simply denounced by their neighbours or other people for, well, perhaps to settle a family grudge or because they'd fallen out somewhere. So millions and millions of Ukrainians simply disappeared or were sent to labour camps. Or in this case, they were murdered by the Nazis during the Second World War. This is the 50th anniversary of the Babi Yar massacre, which we went to, which just happened to be while we were in Kiev. And this is a man standing there with members of his family who died over those 3 days in September 41, I think it was. And this is Bariskovsky forest on the outskirts of Kiev, where it's estimated there's between 100,000 and 200,000 Ukrainians buried, all victims of the Nkvd, which were the forerunners of the KGB, the Soviet secret police. And right up until 89, 90, there was this great big fence around this huge forest, and the Soviets, as I say, took the all people that were shot in Kiev or other parts around Kiev were taken and buried in mass graves there. And right up until kind of 1991, the Soviets always said that any bodies found there were victims of the fascists from the Second World War. But with the uncovering of this kind of Ukraine's forbidden history, it became quite clear that they were victims of the Soviet system, and people whose family members had disappeared would come and kind of pin these kind of memento mori to trees in the forest. This is St. Mykolai Orthodox Church, one of the main Orthodox churches in Kiev, which was closed by the Soviets and used as a grain store. And when we got there, it just recently reopened. As you can see, it's still pretty dilapidated. And services, this was one of the first services held in that church in late 91. And here's Vasil Romaniuk again. It was quite an extraordinary moment when he appeared in this church. It was almost like seeing this vision. You know, I didn't know he was there. I'd already photographed him in Bradford. And there he was leading this service in St. Mykolai's in Kiev. And one of the organizations Rob had made contact with and we joined forces with is an organization called Memorial. This was the Ukrainian version of Memorial. There were different memorials in different republics around the Soviet Union. And as some of you may have read recently, Putin has banned Memorial in Russia. It's still going in Ukraine, well, up until the war, of course. But their kind of main mission at the time we were there was to uncover the crimes of the Soviet system, if you like. And these are people that are queuing up in the memorial offices in Kiev, I think it is, to register what had happened to them in Soviet times. There's lots of documents piled up in the back there in the hope that they could claim some kind of reparation for, you know, family members lost or their own lives lost, either in prison or labor camps in Siberia and so on. And we then moved on to Lviv, which is this incredibly beautiful historic city, formerly part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Here's a mural to the eternal friendship between the Russian and Ukrainian peoples. The Russian woman you can see on the left there with the hammer and sickle above her, and the Ukrainian on the right. And this is a mass baptism being held in, what's it called? The Church of Transfiguration in Lviv. Again, people were not allowed to baptize their children unless they did it in secret. And neither were they allowed to have a religious funeral. So one of the people we met through Memorial, a friend of his, had sadly died in a motorbike accident, and they were holding a proper Ukrainian Catholic funeral where the body lies in an open casket outside the young man's home. Then it was carried through the suburbs of Kiev out into the countryside. And again, I think this expression of Ukrainian Catholicism is very much tied up with Ukrainian culture and identity, which was something that the Soviet authorities were very, well, did their best to stamp out. But as we were there in 91, it suddenly flowered. And this is the young man's coffin arriving at the church where he was buried. You could be arrested for reading the Bible. I'd heard stories in Bradford about how they'd printed these miniature Bibles that measured maybe an inch, 2 inches across, which people would put in their boots, hide in their boots, and walk across the border from Poland with these miniature Bibles hidden in their boots. But this is a Ukrainian man near Lviv reading his Bible. And we also went to a small town called Slavsko, which had been the headquarters for the Nkvd and the KGB in post-war, when the Soviets were fighting a war against Ukrainian kind of partisans who had taken to the rural areas. And for many, many years after the Second World War ended, there were organizations like OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and UPA, who were another partisan organization. And Memorial were excavating these mass graves, where most of the victims were allegedly partisans, but they were actually just ordinary people that were kind of swept up by this kind of red broom. And what Memorial were doing were trying to identify these bodies that were, you know, hundreds of bodies buried on what was effectively the kind of village green, where people would just pass by as their daily life, or children would just stop and watch what was going on their way back from school or what have you. So this is body number 75, I think it is, and they were trying to identify who was in these graves so that they could let friends or relatives, family, know who was buried there, maybe from just small mementos like, I don't know, clothes, cigarette cases, watches, whatever that were found in these graves. And also to identify how these people were killed, which was usually, you know, there were bullet holes in most of these bodies' skulls, as you can see on the right-hand side here. And this is a young woman, not a young woman, an old woman, sorry, who lived not far from Slavsko, who used to be a courier for UPA. So she was a partisan for many years, carrying messages between different UPA groups that were hiding out in the hills and the forests fighting the Soviets. This is a woman collecting cabbages being unloaded off a train. I was going to tell you a story about this picture, but I won't. I better press on because we're running out of time here. But we went to visit schools where they were having to rewrite the curriculum because Ukrainian history was not part of the school curriculum. So this is the librarian of a school in Lviv. There's Taras Shevchenko again on your left-hand side. Young girls singing the national anthem, which again had been forbidden for decades. And here again is a picture of Taras Shevchenko above a school in Lviv who were busy changing the way the school was organised and the curriculum that they taught and so on. And then you can contrast this with a school that we went to in a village called Bariskovsky, again in Western Ukraine, but quite isolated. And what we found was that in the rural areas, change was a lot slower. In the cities, everybody was talking politics, talking independence. But when we got to Bariskovsky, I think we went there because Andrei's grandmother lived there and we stayed with her. But we were the first Westerners to visit the village since the Nazis had left in 1941. And I remember we went into the village shop, which didn't actually have anything to sell at the time, but it was like a kind of social hub and it was full of people talking. And then when people found out that we were from Britain, the shop just emptied. People were actually terrified of being seen to even be in the presence of a foreigner, never mind talk to one. So the schools still have their Lenin Museum and to the, kind of eulogies to the achievements of the Soviet Union. And this is Andrei's grandmother harvesting potatoes, I think it was. And this is what happened, that people that grew food had gone back to growing their own food, whereas the local kolkhoz or collective farm was in complete ruin. People didn't go to the Soviet-run kolkhoz anymore. So this was why it was so difficult to get hold of food in the cities unless you had lots of money or you had contacts in the countryside, because all these kolkhozs had gone to rack and ruin. Here's a queue for cabbages nearby. And then 5 years later, I went back to the east, went back to Ukraine, and I visited the east and went to places like Donetsk. This is a coal mine in the Donbass. And still 5 years later, they've got the Soviet Red Star on top of the winding gear there. This is the great monument in Donetsk to what the Soviets still, or Ukrainians, Russians refer to as the Great Patriotic War. A mural to Soviet socialist kind of style mural to the miners of the Donbass. And I visited a mine. These are miners going down for their shift. And still, statues of Lenin in the main square in Donetsk, for example. This is a young girl's kind of beauty contest. This is a woman in Kiev walking off to her allotment. So these kind of dreams of Ukraine becoming a rich Western European nation. I mean, many people had done very well at independence, but for the vast majority of people, they were still struggling. Life was tough, living in an apartment block, as you see on the right. perhaps growing your own food, having a pretty minimal wage. So this is a young woman begging in Kiev under an advert for one of these new fashion magazines called Natalie that had sprung up. So some people were doing very well, other people weren't. But at least for most, and I think this was the big change, they didn't live in terror anymore. They didn't feel that by practicing their religion, they would be carted off to the gulag, put in prison. This is the opening of reopening of a new church that was attended by President Kuchma, so hence the security guy in the centre there, surrounded by Ukrainian priests. And also that kind of flowering of literature, painting, art, Ukrainian identity. These are some murals on a wall in Kiev again, with some ice cream sellers there. But also that kind of strange mix of the East and Western culture. So you've got these Matryoshka dolls with all this kind of mix of Soviet, McDonald's, Ukrainian tribe kind of iconography. And I'll just finish with this picture I've taken in Ukraine, where you've got, I think this was Kiev Heritage Day. And in many ways, it kind of sums up what I think has kind of, for me, happened in Ukraine over those 5 years, where there had been this great flowering of Ukrainian kind of identity and culture and all the rest of it, which is symbolized by that woman in Ukrainian folk costume in the center. But she's just kind of stepping over to the Coca-Cola concession, and in many ways, kind of this Western consumerism, US-led kind of machine, kind of cultural, merchandising machine had kind of rolled into not just Ukraine, but other parts of Western Europe. And I think people there were really kind of, in many ways, struggling to make sense of that West meets East. And in many ways, I think that's still that kind of struggle that's going on now. And in many ways has led to what's going on in Ukraine and the conflict that's going on with Russia at the moment. So that's it in terms of pictures. There were more to show you, but as ever, I've run slightly over time. So if we leave it there and see what questions anybody's got.
Thanks, Tim. That was really fascinating, really interesting, and it starts to throw a bit of new light, certainly for me, onto what's happening and what's been happening over the last few months. I've got a couple of questions that have come in, and if anyone else would like to put any questions into the Zoom chat, I'll relay those back to Tim. Can
I also just say that I've just spotted that one other person who's in the audience is actually Rob Perks. So if Rob wanted to unmute himself and join in, please do, because he was the person that I travelled with for that extraordinary time in '91.
So we've got one question here asking whether your book from 1997 from Dewi Lewis is still available.
Well, that's it there. I think it is. I mean, I've got it out, not because I want to sell any copies, because I've only got perhaps 3 or 4 left, but I was using it to remind myself of some of the names of the people and some of what have you. I think you can buy it, secondhand. Dewi sold out of it years and years and years ago. It did quite well, actually. And what Dewi said was, he said it was a bit of an odd thing because, sales would kind of trickle along for a while and then suddenly it'd get, I don't know, a dozen sales in Nottingham or a dozen sales in Vancouver or somewhere. And I think what happened was that, as I said earlier, the Ukrainian community is extremely well connected and someone would hear about it or buy a copy. And anyway, we sold books, or Dewi sold books all over the world, but I think you can still buy copies. Goodness knows how much they are on, Amazon or I use a place called Speedy Hen.
We've got a question here about the Ukrainian community in Bradford today, and is it still quite as sort of is it still work sort of together in the same way that it was in the 80s, or has it sort of dispersed out now? Is it still a sort of hub there?
Well, there is still a hub. I mean, of that original generation, there's literally a handful of people left, and they come along to the Elderly Lunch Club, which I think is run on a Wednesday or a Thursday, and there's maybe a dozen people or so. But as you've anticipated, you know, those second and third generation, we're now on to the fourth generation, who are generally younger children. That second and third generation have generally done quite well for themselves. So they've moved out from Bradford. If they're still living in the area, they generally live in the suburbs or more rural areas rather than in a city. But yes, it has become a community that's very dispersed. So if you go to the club on a weekend, it's pretty quiet, but there is this kind of core of people that have remained living in Bradford, generally second generation people who are in their perhaps 50s and 60s and or so, and they very much kind of keep things going. And I think what's happened over the last month or two has really kind of brought the community back together again, and people that perhaps didn't go to church or whatever have come to church. Like I was at the Bradford church just a couple of weeks ago, and a couple of guys came in and they said to someone standing on the door, "Oh, we haven't been here since we were altar boys 40 years ago." You know, but they'd come back and they put, I don't know, big wads of money in the collecting bucket and went in to remind themselves about their Ukrainian heritage, really.
Then we've got another question here asking what your own view is of the future of Ukraine.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
What's your own view of the future of Ukraine at the moment? How do you think things might play out?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, like many people here, I watch the news every night, and you know, I think about it a lot during the day, but I don't think this is really the forum where I can, you know, I'm not a historian, I'm not a political analyst. I read The Guardian for what it's worth. I watch the news every evening on BBC. Sometimes I watch Al Jazeera because that's quite a good antidote to our UK-centric media. Al Jazeera English, I think, is a great thing to watch if you want to get a different take on. But to try and, I mean, I think, you know, stating the obvious, a lot of it is down to what Putin and his inner circle, if he does have one, decides to do next. But as all these kind of world-renowned experts are writing or saying on telly, trying to, you know what's going on inside Putin's head is a complete guessing game. So my guess, you know, is you know, I like to think I'm better informed than perhaps some people, but it's as good as anyone else's, really. I just hope that these talks that are going on in Turkey do bear fruit. But when Russia says, oh, it's withdrawing from northern Ukraine as a sign of goodwill, I just think, well, you know, let's see.
Okay, we got a note from Rob Perks here, just saying great memories of an astonishing trip, some of which he had forgotten about until he saw your great images again. So thank you, Rob.
Hello, Rob.
Hi, everybody. Fantastic to see those images again, Tim. Even one of me looking considerably younger, which is, I suppose, sort of reassuring in a way. I had one quick question for you to reflect on, which I've been thinking about, which would we have done this differently in a digital age? I mean, certainly for me, carrying around all that analog recording equipment, not only was it incredibly heavy, but I had to take hundreds of cassette tapes with me physically in a bag, together with all the other things that we took with us as, you know, gifts and bribes and things to get us through that trip. But I wondered, in terms of you as a photographer, whether working digitally would have meant you work completely differently. I mean, I say that partly because I could at least listen back to the interviews that I'd done during the day, just, you know, listening back on the recorder. But of course, you couldn't see any of the images that you were taking. I wondered if you could reflect a bit on that.
Well, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It was something I was discussing with Michael before the talk kicked off, that I set off with, I don't know, 100 rolls of unexposed film, and I came back with a carrier bag full of 95 rolls of film, which are sitting somewhere in my office behind me. But as you say, I hadn't seen a single frame that I'd shot because there was nowhere to get any film developed. You know, the place was absolute chaos. So I hadn't seen a single picture that I'd taken, which is kind of exciting, you know, the big reveal when you get back and you go in the dark room and do all that developing business that maybe some of people in the audience are old enough to remember. And it is a different way of working, I suppose. And to answer your question, would I do it differently now? Well, yes, I'm older, my responsibilities are different. But the point is, I haven't gone. That's the biggest change, I think. I mean, I'm not a conflict photographer, but when you and I were in Ukraine, I know for almost a fact that there were 3 other photographers from the West there. There was, I think it was David Turnley. There's 2 Turnley brothers. I can't remember which one it was. A guy called Mike Goldwater was there shortly before we were. He was a well-known press photographer at the time. So there was Mike Goldwater there. One of the Turnley brothers was there. There was a guy called James Hill, who I think was working for the New York Times. And there was me and one other bloke I can't remember. And that was it, you know. And now we're watching, you know, a deluge of still pictures, videos coming out in real time from Ukraine. And I think, well, I could go, but what's the point? You know, I wouldn't get, I don't work for I used to work for the Observer and the Guardian and so on, as well as the Heritage Unit back in '91. So we spent hardly any money in Ukraine. You know, we spent quite a lot on taking cigarettes and razor blades and other things that you couldn't buy in Ukraine. I remember people said to me, what shall I take? Oh, razor blades, they're small, they're light, and you can't get hold of them. So we took razor blades and we gave them to people, either people that had hosted us as a kind of present, or people that we wanted to get access to somewhere, you know, or, you know, go away, leave us alone, here's a packet of cigarettes. So that's what we did. And perhaps that just reminds me of one other story, that one of our translators, Yulia, who I think you employed in Lviv, what we did, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, we used to get in touch with the local university where we were going. And I certainly did this on the second trip I went there. So we get in touch with the English department of the university and say, have you got any broad-minded, independent, go-getter, good English students? And I think that's how we got Yulia, and that's how I got my translators fixers for the second trip. And Yulia, who came with us to Slavsko and Lviv and Strian places, I remember she brought it to England with her because people couldn't understand what inflation, post-Soviet inflation, had done in Ukraine. And she bought a tram ticket from one side of Lviv to the other. And she said the value of this tram ticket was the value of my grandmother's life savings. You know, that was just thousands and thousands and thousands of percent of annual inflation of the hryvnia, the Ukrainian currency. So yeah, very, very different times, both photographically, and I think also really hard, and perhaps you can I'll stop talking in a minute, really hard for people like us who had lived in democratic countries for all of our adult lives. I've lived a lot in other places, but you know, as a child you don't take notice of politics. But coming from a democratic country, to understand what it was like to live in a totalitarian state was just even though we were there, it was just hard to imagine. And I remember you would often in your interviews, you would say to people, well, why did that happen? And people would say to you, if you lived here, you never asked why. Why was a dangerous question. I mean, do you want to say something about that, perhaps?
Well, no, just what you said, really. I mean, I think it was an incredibly formative trip in all the ways that you've described. But as you say, just getting a sense of the pervasive nature of the Soviet system was something I hadn't really been prepared for. Even though I'm a historian, I'd read all the standard books and so on. The degree to which it really crept into every possible part of life and created a sort of mental framework that meant that even when we were there, long after things had been, it was safer to speak. There were places, Tim, where we went, where people not only sort of ran away, but were actively afraid of us. I remember interviewing one woman in that school, in that small village, and she just shook with terror the whole time that we were there interviewing her. So, I mean, I don't think we can underestimate the degree to that is still pervasive amongst that generation in Ukraine now, and obviously still in Russia, which perhaps explains some of the sort of Russian attitude to the war in Ukraine at the moment. I don't think we should underestimate the degree to which people's whole psyches and mind frames have been really acculturated by that Soviet system and the fear of the Soviet system coming back. It seems to me that's exactly what Putin is, in fact, trying to take Russia back to. But
yeah, I think that's also why I think is a big factor, and why so many Ukrainians, and Zelensky, expresses it himself, they have this kind of no surrender attitude. And I think part of the reason they're not going to surrender, and they'd rather die than surrender, is people of our age, me and your age, Rob, they've lived more than half their lives under the Soviet system, and they know what it's like. And like you've just said, Russian occupation, they don't just want to destroy people's lives and the physical landscape as they are at the moment. I feel that Putin wants to obliterate Ukrainian culture and identity. That's what he wants to do, and the Ukrainians won't have it. And I think also that's another big thing with the communities here, is that kind of almost Stalin-esque kind of I mean, it's different to Stalin's time because of digital media and so on. They can't keep the lid on things like Stalin used to do. But that kind of Stalinist attitude has really brought back memories for a lot of Ukrainians. And a woman that I was talking to, she's second generation Ukrainian, probably about, around about my age. She said, I just sit down and cry every day. And she says, I'm just so glad my parents aren't here.
I think probably on that note, it's probably time to draw proceedings to a close. So firstly, Tim, thanks so much for sharing your recollections and particularly your photographs with us as well, both from this country and Ukraine. And thank you, Rob, also for contributing towards the end as well. It's been really, really great to bring the two of you back. And I think the important thing for the audience, well, firstly, thank you for joining us tonight, but this event was organised by Tim as a way of arranging funds and donations for the Digital Emergencies Committee to raise aid for Ukraine and the humanitarian effort there. So please do take the opportunity to donate to DEC and support the humanitarian relief. And Tim's also giving some further talks around this subject at the National Media Museum and elsewhere. So look out for those if you're in the Bradford area or beyond. Tim, thank you so much for this evening. Thank you to our audience. And please remember the people in Ukraine through donating through DEC.
And can I just say briefly one other thing? Thanks for coming. Thanks for hosting it, Michael. And if you do live in a town or city where there is a Ukrainian community, and they do have a club or a church, I think it's really important for them as well to see that the wider British community is thinking about what's going on. So if you just want to go and sit for 10 minutes in the back pew of the Ukrainian church, or go and have a drink at the club or whatever, do it and talk to people, because they want to talk. And I don't think it's an intrusion on grief or upset. It's showing support. So as well as giving your money to DC, if you are living in one of those places where Ukrainians are, just go and talk to people. And maybe even take some pictures if you're a photographer.
Even better. Thank you, Tim. Thanks so much this evening. And again, on behalf of the Royal Photographic Society, thanks to the audience for joining us this evening. And as Tim says, do please donate to the DEC or visit your local Ukrainian community and engage with them. I think that would be appreciated. Good night, everyone.